Today's focus is going to be on the different mixing styles that exist. Of course, when it comes to mixing music, nobody can tell you that there's wrong answers or a very specific way to do things. Sure, there are sort of like standardized methods or perhaps like some sort of like agreed upon sort of standardizations, ways that we usually do things. But the wonderful thing about mixing is that it's a super creative process. And as long as you can justify the things that you've done by being able to define or describe some sort of intention that you have, then nobody can tell you that you've done anything wrong, right? As long as you can say, well, I was going for this type of sound or I wanted this result, then you can kind of get creative in the ways that you go about achieving those results. But it's really a subjective art. So when I think about the different mixing styles, I'm really thinking about my experience as a mix engineer, but also as a student learning about this stuff in grad school and undergraduate, and talking with other mixing engineers. And it seems to be relatively understood that there are some geographical locations associated with different mixing styles or techniques. So let's talk about that first style, which is going to be LA mixing. So if you can think that before the internet and everything, maybe different geographic regions were sort of adopting particular methods of performing the mix process. Well, we start with LA mixing. And what this really is an approach to mixing music that emphasizes the real world sound that was being recorded, right? Our process, our approach in LA mixing is going to be to perfect and enhance the existing sounds, but to preserve their original integrity. And what I mean by that is that when you listen to an example of LA mixing, typically classic rock music or something like that, but that's an easy way to say, well, a lot of music was approached in an LA mix technique during that time, but certainly there's modern day examples too. But a drum set is going to sound like a drum set. An electric guitar is going to sound like an electric guitar as if it's coming straight out of an amplifier, the way that you would imagine that it would sound naturally. So there's going to be this emphasis on maybe cleaning up a sound. If there's any problems with the original recordings that came in, that's where we're going to spend most of our time, is addressing any issues, but not necessarily doing any sort of like major enhancements or lots of layers, things like that. No, what we want to do is preserve the integrity of that original project that was being recorded. So that's what the focus of LA mixing is. All right. Not a lot of super fancy sort of things. Yes, we're going to do things like panning. Sure. Equalization and dynamics. Yeah, we're going to use those tools, but in a more sparing kind of way, and also in a way that is transparent. One that allows us to sort of like get through that process and and see through into like maybe just a more polished version of the original recordings. All right, not a whole bunch of like extra work being done in this process. So that takes us to New York mixing. This approach to mixing obviously developed or is like attributed to the New York music scene. But what this really is a focus on lots of layers of sounds, and as a result, a mix that is larger than life. This is when you're going to hear a bunch of, say, stacks of different instruments, right? So maybe, or duplications of audio tracks. So that, let's take an electric guitar, for example. An electric guitar can be a pretty big and powerful sound in and of itself. But you know what makes it even bigger and more powerful? If we have multiple different either recordings or duplications of the same electric guitar performance, and then we process it and do a whole bunch of different things to each duplicate, and then we layer those things all on top of each other, and what we wind up with is this huge, big, full sound that we couldn't have achieved with just the original recording, all right? Now, it might still sound like an electric guitar, but it's going to sound like the beefiest, biggest electric guitar ever. Same thing goes for vocals or for drums. You can apply this New York mixing technique that has lots of layers. And another sort of term that we use is parallel processing. So we take the original recording here, and then we take a copy of itself and process it in lots of different ways. Maybe we take several different parallel versions of itself and process each one differently, and then group it all back together. And what we come up with is something that sounds much bigger, much larger, much more, shall I say, grandiose than the original recording. I've seen some mixing engineers demonstrate some of the or revisit some mixes that they've worked on. An example I can think of is Chris Lord-Alge, who's a famous mixing engineer, talking about mixing guitars for the band Muse. And he had like 20 to 25 different electric guitar layers of one single performance, just to build the right kind of fullness, the right kind of sound with lots of different things happening that we're looking for. So New York mixing is this emphasis on making something bigger and more full and larger than life. That brings us to London mixing. And London mixing is an interesting sort of meld of the approach with New York style mixing. Yeah, we want it to be big and full potentially, but London mixing places an emphasis on sort of these transitionary processes. What I mean is, like, consider a song arrangement where there's a verse and a chorus and a bridge and things like that. We're going to process different elements of our mix differently as we lead from one section of the song to the next, to sort of give us momentum and to lead us forward. So in London mixing, there might be lots of layers, but what we're going to see is those layers evolve over time much more, as opposed to New York mixing, which is making things really huge and full all the time. Well, that might sound great, but the London mix, although it might have lots of layers, is going to take a different approach, and it's going to use those layers as a method of driving us forward, of creating change over time to make really interesting things happen. And that creates a really unique sort of method in which the listener gets to sort of go on a journey that changes and evolves over time. And I think that it's safe to say that London mixing, all these different things that we've talked about, London and New York and LA, all of those things, all those ideas now have been mashed together in what I'm calling modern mixing. And that approach is to take all these different influences and merge them all together. And on top of that, you've got to think, because of the accessibility of modern technology, meaning more people have access to it, or it's easier to access, and more people are doing mixing, mastering, recording of music all on their own because of the ease of technology and virtual instruments and things. So take all of those different mix techniques, ball them all up into one, and take influences from each, but then add the added element of mixing as you create, and that's sort of the new modern mixing method. So a lot of people are like overdubbing, creating entire arrangements of songs through the process of overdubbing, creating maybe a bass riff, and then layering another sound on top of that, and then going back and recording. And all along the way, they're mixing during the process. So that's a little bit different, as opposed to treating recording and mixing as two completely different things. By mixing during the recording process as you're building a song arrangement. So that's sort of the modern approach to that. Hopefully that's helpful. And when you're approaching a mix project yourself, consider, what type of genre am I working with? What type of mixing style does this music lend itself to? And that'll get you at least a starting point to go in a particular direction. Yeah, you might decide to use particular techniques that belong to one or more of those styles, but at least, like, by observing the project that you're going to be working with, you can kind of use these foundational LA mixing, New York mixing, London mixing as sort of a guide to get you going in a particular direction.